Good evening. Hey, I'm Lori Marhofer. I'm a professor here in the history department. It's my pleasure to introduce Robin Stacey tonight. Welcome back to the 2023 History Lecture Series. So as a reminder, after the lecture, we're going to have a short Q&A period, and you can use the note cards that were handed out when you walked in to write down your questions. We're going to collect them after the lecture. We'd ask that if, insofar as you can, please stay through the Q&A rather than walking out in the break because it's distracting, although we understand people have other obligations, so certainly make your own judgment. So this is the fourth installment in the remarkable lecture series on the medieval made modern, and it's my honor to once again introduce our speaker, Professor Robin Stacey. Professor Stacey has been introduced several times already, so I'm not going to do as good a job and rather leave time for this exciting lecture. I know that we're all here for the Templars. But Robin is a distinguished scholar of medieval Ireland, Wales, and England, a winner of the Distinguished Teaching Award at UW and many, many, many other honors, known as a master teacher as well as an outstanding scholar with an international reputation. Professor Stacey has long been a very important figure in our department. Please join me in welcoming Professor Robin Stacey back to the stage.
All right, does that work? Okay, excellent. That's always good news. Oh, you know what I forgot? My pointer, outside purse pocket. There will be a short moment while I assemble the equipment needed. Yeah, there it is, thank you. The equipment needed to, make those laser pointers go. All right. Okay, so I thought I would start by explaining the title of tonight's lecture, since those of you who have contemplated the Templars at any length, presumably relatively few of you, honestly, but probably would not associate it with lunatics. But in fact, that comes from this guy, Umberto Eco, who is a very famous medievalist, a semiotician, a world-renowned scholar who was, he's deceased now. Some of you may know him as the author of The Name of the Rose, which is a great medieval mystery story, really wonderful. And we will find out at the end of the lecture why it is that he made this comment about those who talk about Templars. But in the meantime, you guys have been forewarned. What can I say? I'm about to do just that. Now, with the Templars, we're kind of breaking new ground in this series, in that this is the first time we're actually talking about a group or an individual who is historically real, without question. Obviously, dragons have a few problems in that respect. Arthur and Robin Hood are myths, but it's hard to know whether they were anything more than that. But the Templars are different. They are a historically real group. And they are an instance of a historical group getting mythologized. And as you'll see later in the lecture, boy, do they get mythologized. A little hint of that is visible here in some of the Templar literature and games that are available at the moment, and I will be talking some about that. Now, the real Templars, the historical Templars, have their origins in Jerusalem and in the Crusades. As many of you will know, Jerusalem is a city sacred to Jews, Muslims, and Christians. For Jews, it is the site of the temples of Solomon and Herod, around, beneath, on top of the Temple Mount. For Muslims, it is the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the oldest in the Muslim world, and the Dome of the Rock, which is a very early surviving Islamic shrine, the oldest, in fact. For Christians, Jerusalem is, of course, the site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And although if you visit Jerusalem today, the church you see today is not the one that the Emperor Constantine built in the 4th century, there are plenty of shrines and walls and things remaining from that early period. And of course, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is something that has been visited by pilgrims and worshiped at for centuries regardless. Jerusalem was taken by Muslims in the 7th century, taken from the Byzantines. And one of the first things they did was to show great tolerance in allowing members of other faiths to visit that city. Byzantines did not allow Jews, in fact, to come in. But that Jerusalem changes hands over the course of the centuries after that among different Muslim rulers from different parts of the Arab world. And as you can see, attacks begin to increase on Christians trying to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in that period. One of the Fatimid caliphs actually orders the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and even though it was later rebuilt by his son, that sends enough of a shockwave through the West to spark conversations about a crusade, an armed venture to go and recapture the Holy Land, as it's called in Western discourse. In 1071, the Seljuk Turks take Jerusalem and other Byzantine lands, and attacks on pilgrims increase, and that brings us to the calls for the First Crusade in the West. This is an illustration of Pope Urban II preaching the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont. One of the points it makes clear is that this is actually a papal endeavor, as well as an endeavor that sees the involvement of many aristocratic nobles and high-placed others in the West, answering this call for a crusade to Jerusalem with the specific idea of taking that city for the West. As you can see, the army arrives before Jerusalem in June of 1099, and they capture it. And the reports of the slaughter, indiscriminate, horrific, committed there by Christian troops are really quite gruesome, but they take it in July of 1099. That leads to the establishment of 4 principal Crusader states. And this is more or less what they look like in the mid-12th century, the county of Edessa. Actually, that falls in 1144, so let's say early 12th century. The Principality of Antioch, County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It's always rough to get population estimates, of course, for these sorts of things, but this is a pretty widely accepted estimate about how many Westerners were in those 4 Crusader states in and around the late 12th century. But of course, one of the other reasons it's hard to get population statistics is that people move in and move out. And so it's very difficult. Even though there are quite a few Westerners there, a real minority of them are military figures, particularly heavily armed knights of the sort that can make a big difference in war in this period. And that means that danger on the roads for pilgrims continues. And of course, the other thing that comes in here is the fact that the Crusader states are always something of a dicey venture, a fragile venture, and fighting is going to continue up until the fall of Acre, which I'll talk about in a minute, in 1291. And this is the context in which the Templars are formed. They are founded after an attack on 700 pilgrims making their way to Jerusalem, and they are founded with the specific intent of providing military protection for Christians in and visiting the Holy Land. They model themselves, even though they're an armed order and very specifically military, they model themselves on monasticism. Like ordinary monks, they take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The difference is that whereas an ordinary monk's work is the spiritual work of praying or illuminating manuscripts or whatever, for Templars that work was fighting or helping others to fight. In the case of those who are not knights themselves, but who are kind of subsidiary personnel, those who help with knights. You'll see that, and this becomes kind of ironic later, I guess, that their own name for themselves stress the poverty aspect. And that's something that is worth holding on to, because it's something that is going to disappear as time goes on. The king of Jerusalem at the time, they are founded 1119, 1120, gives part of the Al-Aqsa Mosque complex to the Templars as their headquarters. And they take their name then, Templars, instead of the fighters of the poor, they take their name from the temple, since the Temple Mount is thought to be the Temple of Solomon. That's why they're called the Templars. So this is what Jerusalem looks like then in the Crusader period. And as you can see, there are a number of changes from what existed earlier. This whole area, which had the Dome of the Rock, which is right there, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque right there, has now become the Templar headquarters. And this it remains as long as the Westerners hold Jerusalem into the late 12th century. And you can see, some of the other ways that the city has really changed over time. Now, the Templars attract a lot of support, money, gifts, enthusiasm from the West, mainly because they are very visible sort of outreach for those who wish to become pilgrims to Jerusalem, and because they are perceived, rightly, to be frontline fighters in the Western attempt to hold the Crusader kingdoms. One of their patrons, Bernard of Clairvaux, happens to be one of the great clerics of the 12th century, probably the main Christian, the most visible Christian cleric of the 12th century. He becomes their patron and does everything he can to promote them, and even is the first to sponsor a rule, like the monastic rule. I said they ordered themselves on monastic principles. Bernard of Clairvaux sponsors a rule that guides their way of life, and again, it is a very monastic way of life. Although you can see inherent in the sort of title and first line here is an acknowledgement of their specifically military venture. And I should mention here that the Templars are not the only Crusader order to be founded in this period. The Hospitallers also, who run the Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem, owe their foundation to this context and this period. Mid-12th century, the Templar order is getting more and more recognized, more and more familiar, and their clothing is established by a papal pronouncement in 1145. And this is pretty much what the definition of Templars looks like in the mid-12th century. They are fighting monks. I mean, that's very much how they are perceived and how they perceive themselves. Some very important aspects of them: they collect tithes on their own lands, which is another way of getting revenue. They can keep booty taken in battle, again, something that's going to provide them with a lot of lands in the future, both here and in Spain and Portugal, where they will also involve themselves in the reconquest of lands held by Muslim lords. And they are answerable only to the Pope. And that's a special sort of privilege. As we'll see, it's one that doesn't really help them in the end, but is one that they are very keen on and proud to claim. This is established as their clothing, and any of you who have ever played Templar video games or read books about Templars or whatever will recognize this right away. This is the sign that was on the King Arthur flower, for example, which I said was more Templar than King Arthur. They become enormously wealthy. They are very involved, as I say. They become one of the major military prop of Crusader ventures in the Holy Land. They acquire lands. They start building castles. All of these red dots are Templar castles. They also build a number of churches. I don't have a slide that shows the churches, but there are a number of those as well. And as I said, this happens also in Spain and Portugal, where you find Templars involving themselves in what, from the Western point of view, was the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain, which had been in Muslim hands since 711, so the reconquest aspect is a matter of perspective, but there it is. In return for fighting, in return for protecting pilgrims for the Christian works they do, they take donations, sometimes in money, sometimes in land. And here you can see about the size of the order at the height of its popularity, its strength, etc. And you'll note here that it's really only a minority of Templars, or those associated with the Templars, who are actual heavily armed fighting knights. A lot of them are resource personnel, auxiliary personnel, etc. Here's some of the places they built, just to let you know something of what they look like. Many of them, as you can tell, are still visitable by tourists today, and they're spread out all over the place. They're not just in one particular area. We happen to have some figures enabling us to know something about how big the garrison was in this particular one here, and that tells you a bit about what the Templar castle might have looked like in peacetime, when, in other words, when they're not actively at war. Now, all this time, they're accumulating power, they're accumulating wealth, they're accumulating donations, lands, booty, etc. And that begins to tell against them. It becomes a source of criticism aimed at the Templars. And I should say that in this, they are like every other religious order of the 12th and 13th centuries in the West. It's very hard to think of any order. Say the Cistercians would be a great comparison here. Premier 12th century religious order, very much known for kind of building castles and, building churches, on the kind of outskirts of Christendom. They acquire a lot of wealth, a lot of lands, and they too become subject to these criticisms about increasing wealth and being corrupt and greedy, etc. Same thing happens with the Franciscans, etc. But the Templars really come in for it, partly because their acquisitions, their castles, their churches are so visible, partly because they're just so much part of the face of Western endeavors in the Crusader kingdoms. And one of the things that will come back to haunt them later is the fact that they do seem to have been involved in exploring and developing, etc., some of the temples that are under the Temple Mount. Actually, if you go there today, you can actually tour many of the tunnels underneath, say the foundations of Herod's temple, for example. And there's all sorts of rumors that begin to start about what they're doing there and what's going on and what they might be finding, etc. In response to this, the Templars actually adopt a seal that is specifically aimed at those criticisms. It shows two knights so poor they have to share a single horse. I don't know that this actually works, but it is something that is telling, I think, about the extent to which those criticisms were having an impact. Now, as I say, Crusader kingdom's always a dicey venture, and not surprisingly, things start to go very badly from the Western point of view. The county of Edessa is the first to fall, 1144, but the great defeats, the most premier defeats, come at the hands of Sultan Salah ad-Din, often called Saladin, in the late 12th century. And I've listed here some of his both victories and losses. I think what this shows you is how even victories of the Templars, this is actually a victory at Montgisard. It's actually a victory, but they lose 80 knights. And when you're talking about as relatively small a number as they had, that's a major loss. And then there's this very spectacular visible loss here in May of 1187 when only 3 Templar knights escaped. And Saladin takes a different approach depending on who he's captured. But in many instances, when he captures Templar knights, he has them beheaded because they are particularly dangerous to him. But the big battles, the big loss centers around Jerusalem. The Battle of Hattin in July 1187. And here it's a very big sort of major thing in the West. The Crusaders go into battle carrying the relic of the true cross, and they are then defeated. And the relic itself is dishonored, is by being paraded upside down and then sent to Damascus. I think it was last heard of somewhere in Syria, but nobody quite knows where it went. But the huge news in the West was the recapture of Jerusalem, which happens in October of 1187. It's absolutely scarring news in the West. It prompts a huge kind of outcry in the West about the need to go rescue the Holy Land for Christianity. And the Third Crusade, which is a direct response to the loss of Jerusalem, is led by the 3 principal monarchs of Western Europe. They're not, shall we say, working well together. 2 of them really hate each other, the English and the French guy, and the French guy gets kind of miffed and goes home. And I mean, it's just a disaster. But it shows how important that whole fall of Jerusalem and Jerusalem was as a symbol. And the rest of the story is pretty quickly told. There are 8 crusades in all, and almost all of them are disasters of one sort or another. The Second Crusade, which is the one to launch to try to recapture Edessa, the first of the kingdoms to fall, doesn't work out at all. Although I think it does feature Eleanor of Aquitaine riding bare-breasted across the desert. So it's not an entire loss from that point of view. If we can't have Errol Flynn's thighs tonight, we might as well have Eleanor of Aquitaine's attributes. The Fourth Crusade, you couldn't make up, honestly. The Fourth Crusade gets distracted by the fact that they have no money, and they get in hoc to Venice, and the Venetians say, well, actually, there's a few things we'd like you to do in return for our money, which is to go capture these places that aren't anywhere near where you intend to go, but which we'd kind of like to hold. They end up actually sacking the Christian capital of Constantinople in 1204, which results in, among other things, the single greatest transfer, read massive theft, of relics, Christian relics, from the east to the west, known in medieval history. So how's that for Christian crusader action for you? The only successful crusade, this is great, is Frederick II in 1228-29. He's under excommunication at the time because he's He's been in a pretty constant war with the Pope at the moment. And you know how he gets Jerusalem? He gets a 10-year lease on Jerusalem. And he does it by looking at the military situation, saying, well, that's not going to work. And saying, you know, I'm really interested in falconry. And I think the guy who has Jerusalem now is too. So I'm going to send him my work on falconry, and we'll get together and we'll see what we can work out. And he gets there, and the Muslim ruler likes him, and he says, so Fred, take Jerusalem. That's fine, you know, for 10 years. And that is the only time that Jerusalem is back in Western hands in the period of the Crusades. What that tells you about war versus, say, falconry, I can't tell you. The Seventh Crusade, there's a wonderful narrative about this. It's pathetic. There's not much else to say. Now, many of these are led by kings, and they can't all be blamed on the Templars by any means, but that's not the view in the West, because the Templars are the visible symbol of this, of the Crusader kingdoms. They're blamed for it. They're blamed for all of these disasters. And as you can see here, one by one, they all begin to fall. The kingdom of Acre, that's really just the remnant of what's left after Jerusalem falls, of what had been the kingdom of Jerusalem. Acre, which is a fabulous city, by the way, I highly recommend visiting it. Great seafood. It falls in 1291. And that's it for the Crusader kingdoms right there. The Templar castle at Acre, it's defended to the last. The Grand Master himself is killed, but that is the end. And by the way, if you do visit the city, it's really cool. You can go through the tunnel that the Templars used to get from the city down to the sea with their horses. It's still extant, still there to be visited. So the Templars are widely blamed for this. They get back to Europe, and they're still trying to sell the idea of crusade. But Europeans, by this point, not that interested. There's just not much enthusiasm. Now, that is one source of criticism of the Templars. The other has to do with their financial role. So I think most people know about the Templars as fighters and crusaders. But what many people don't know is that the Templars, by virtue of their activities in the Holy Land, in Europe, etc., become international bankers. They are the international banking system of the day. And they do it all. If you're a crusader from France, you want to deposit, some of your treasure in France and then pick it up on the other end so you don't have to carry it with you and get robbed along the way, that's something the Templars can arrange. They take the deposit, they take the records, and they provide you with money on the other end. Templars are very active in financing crusades in general. They administer the taxes for crusades, and they become bankers to kings. They loan out huge amounts of money to Western monarch, some having to do with the Crusades, not necessarily all of it. And we happen to know that they're charging King Edward I of England, by the way, 20% interest on the loan. What really gets them, well, nobody likes bankers, right? At least if you're not intending to pay back your loan. What really gets them is this. The French monarchy is deeply, deeply in debt to the Templars. And you have to imagine money in this period, much of wealth is held, movable wealth, tangible wealth, is held in the form of treasure, of armor, of jewels, of horses, of, things like that, and not just bullion. And the places where the Templars kept this movable wealth, some of these buildings survived into the modern period. If you visit London, you can still visit the London Temple Church. and see one of them. The Paris temple was destroyed in the course of the revolution, but we have here a picture of what it looked like. Actually, it was destroyed a little past this, the revolution time. But that's what it looked like. They look like fortresses, and there's a reason for that, because they're holding a lot of money and goods. And you know what? That's what gets them in the end as an order. Specifically, what gets them is the fact that the French monarchy is so far in debt to them. And that brings us to this lovely king, lovely man, Philip IV of France. It is said of him that he divided all of his people who could be taxed into two categories. One category of people who paid before dying, and the other category of those who still owed after they died. So that tells you right there about his interest in money. And he owes a bundle to the Templars, and he's not interested in paying for it. He's also enmeshed in a kind of church-state battle between himself and the Pope, where he is making claim very directly to be kind of the head of the clergy in France. And the Pope is saying, no, you're not. I'm the head of all clergy all the way through Christendom. And this battle between them goes on in the form of declarations and documents and meetings and things like that. But this is actually one of the places where this controversy plays out. Because Philip, overnight, out of the blue, orders the surprise arrest of all Templars in France on Friday the 13th. And we don't think that's where it comes from, but it can't hurt, so there it is. But can you imagine an arrest of about 2,000 men simultaneously in different parts of the country? Furthermore, Philip accompanies this with a very well worked out program of propagandistic slander, in which he accuses the Templars not only of greed, corruption, illicit banking, etc., not only of having lost the Crusades, but of all sorts of weird, mysterious heresies and rites and things like that. And he engages in a smear campaign. There's no other way around it. When the Templars are taken overnight, they're put in castles like this or in dark towers. This is actually a small town in the Dordogne in southern France. This is the gate to the town, one of the gates of the town. And there were more than 100 Templars enclosed in that tower. And believe me, it's not large. And there's very few windows. You can see, actually, just a slit there. And they were held for months, and a number of them dying, etc. So Philip claims to be acting on behalf of Christianity and with piety as his motive and getting rid of this greedy corruption and heretical group, etc. But his real motive is money. There's not much question about that. He hot-foots it over to the temple, confiscates all the goods that are there, and cancels all the loans that he owes to the Templars. Now, so what does a pope do? Do you remember that Templars are answerable to the Pope alone? Well, this particular Pope is not in great shape. He's a French Pope, and he's the first one to move the papacy from Rome to Avignon, which is not at that point part of France, but is right on the French border. He's not in a very strong position, in other words. And this is part of this sort of, who is in control of the clergy? Is it the Pope claiming control over all Christendom? Or is it the guy with the troops and the armies to enforce the fact that he's claiming as French king to be in charge of the French clergy? The Pope was caught by surprise, like everybody else, and he has to play catch-up. So he goes ahead and he orders. He pretends to take this whole heresy thing seriously, and he orders the arrest of the Templars. in Christendom, not just in France, and confiscates their property. And what he's trying to do, of course, is get there before the kings do. In France, he does not, alas. The temple is quite empty by the time he arrives. In 1308, shortly after this, he declares that the Templars are misguided, but they're not heretical. But by that time, hundreds of Templars had confessed in France under torture to all sorts of bizarre, weird, sexual, obscene, heretical rites. And even though many of them recant, after that, it does them not much good. Many of them are tried and convicted, some executed as lapsed heretics, and the damage has been done to their reputation. The smear campaign was so successful that the Pope feels that he has no choice but to suppress the entire order in 1312, and he is so impotent in terms of the French monarchy that he can't protect the Grand Master of the order from being executed in 1314, Jacques de Molay, who dies looking towards the Notre Dame. So there you are. And you can still see, by the way, you remember that tower I showed you, this one? That is full of graffiti, scratched by the fingernails of Templars held there by whatever implements they can find. A lot of it is anti-King Philip graffiti, and some of it is anti-Pope graffiti too, because they perceive him as not supporting them and as complicit. So, as I say, the motive is financial pretty clearly, but in the accusations made against them, we can see the beginning of the legend of the Templars, of the mythology of the Templars, which I will be talking about next. Philip, in spreading these rumors, and I've put the main ones up here, Philip is building on all sorts of rumors and kind of, the mystery of what the Templars are doing up there on the Temple Mount and what they're doing in the tunnels and what kind of rituals they have, which are believed to be secret. He's building on suspicions that are already there, but enhancing them also. And you can see here that a lot of things are being conflated. They're accused of worshiping this idol in secret, which might be a cat, or it might be a head of a man, and the name has been suggested as perhaps a confused version of Muhammad. Nobody really knows, of course, and it's basically a propagandistic smear. This becomes one of the major things known about them, accusations, the kissing of the anus, the obscene kiss at the base of the spine. And I should say the Templars are not the only groups that are accused of that. And one of the other things that adds to the whole mystery of the Templars, and is still a mystery today, so those of you who like a mystery, this is still kind of cool. Nobody ever found the Templar treasure, and nobody ever found those account books. And there must have been there. They had to be there. There's no way that this sort of international banking system that we were talking about could have survived without records of some sort, but they haven't been found. And we know that the Templars kept a treasure ship, or more than one, anchored off the coast of the Holy Land for precisely the sorts of monetary exchanges they need to make. Where did it go? We don't know. And that also added to this reputation of secret rituals, of secrets, of mysteries, etc. And that brings us to their afterlife. And here is where, indeed, the lunatic is entering the room, because some of them are really quite incredible. So the mythologizing of the Templars, positive and negative, right? Starts even before the king takes his action and the Templars are dissolved. And a lot of this at first is positive. They are associated in many 13th century works, I put up a couple of them here, with the Grail. And they get woven into Grail legends and perceived as the keepers, the guardians of the Grail. And of course, the idea behind this is that they somehow found the Grail during their time in Jerusalem when they were digging around in all those tunnels. And there's all sorts of stories about that. But the negative mythologizing begins early also. And this is one of the early ones here, a treatise on witchcraft dating to, excuse me, the late 15th, early 16th century, which shows us a phenomenon that's going to become very, very familiar to us. And that is the kind of conflation of the Templars with other suspect groups. So this guy writes about Gnostic magicians. Gnostic is a name given to early forms of Christianity, well, often Christianity, occurring in biblical period. You may have heard the expression Gnostic Gospels. These are Gospels that did not make it into the authorized version of the Bible. Many of them are fascinating, by the way, very interesting. But the Gnostics, too, accumulate this kind of air of mystery, this attitude of mystery. And here they are, Gnostic magicians and Templars, who are demons and witches. And what do? They sacrifice with their private parts bared, presumably a version of this obscene kiss. In the 18th century, we start to see another development that becomes probably the most prominent aspect of Templar mythologizing, and that is the joining of Templars and Freemasons. Now, not a lot is known about the origins of the Freemasons. We have a lot of different myths, some appearing to come from within the Masons, some from outside, linking them both to the story of the building of Solomon's Temple in the Bible and to guilds of stonemasons in the Middle Ages. But the earliest attested modern Masons or Masonic lodges that we might recognize are 18th century. And you can see them here, London and Massachusetts. And from the very beginning, they attract a lot of the same sort of interest about what they're doing, about what their rituals are. They're claiming ancient or even biblical origins. And that brings them pretty closely into the ambit of the same suspicions being voiced about the Templars. And this guy is one of the major people involved in that. He either invents or is the first to write down the idea that Freemasons were Templars. He asserts that Freemason lodges are a repository of secret codes, that the rituals and codes and secret language used in Freemasonry were developed in the Holy Land as a way of fooling Muslim enemies to the Templars. And he asserts a special role for Scotland, and we're going to see this continue on too. Develops this idea that when the Templars get kicked out of France, those who leave without being executed or permanently imprisoned escape to Scotland and set up housekeeping there. As far as we can tell, assuming he was the one that invented this myth, he was doing it to give Masonry a kind of an appeal to aristocrats and nobles in Scotland. Why he thought this would help, I don't know. But he has said, first of all, to have tried to make this story about the Hospitallers, but they were still in existence and they didn't want anything to do with it. So he changed quickly to the Templars. But, you know, the phrase attributed to him, every Mason is a Knight Templar, is the one that really sticks. And look at what happens to that story. It gets more and more elaborated as the 18th century wears on and into the 19th century. And a lot of these guys are fixated on the Scottish connection. This one here, George Frederick Johnson, He associates the Templars with ancient Jewish Essene wisdom, again regarded as a kind of mystery group. But he makes up this whole story about Jacques de Molay, that Grand Master who was executed by Philip in 1314 looking at Notre Dame, that Jacques de Molay somehow had time to order the temple treasure at Paris to be taken to Scotland, and then the Templars take on the name Freemasons. And look at what the Templar treasure is now believed to contain. The Crowd of Jerusalem and a shroud. Well, guess what, guys? That's not any shroud. This is already an idea we're going to see later develop, the idea that the Templars also have found were guardians of the Shroud of Turin, which actually doesn't appear in Europe till about 1350, which is interesting. And this story keeps getting bigger. Charles de Gassicourt, this is great. Jacques de Molay, in his dying breath, curses the entire French monarchy, and that's why the French Revolution happened, because the Templars were really taken, they were really ticked off at this. It's now absolutely taken for granted that Masons are Templars. This is one of my favorite. It's even claimed that the reason Robert the Bruce won at Bannockburn is because some of those fighting on his side were actually Templar knights, and they were, better than most fighters. By the early 19th century, there are Masonic lodges all over Britain and claiming and talking loudly about Templar origins. Middle of the century, we find this guy just sort of repeating the whole idea. I love this. To prove that the Order of the Knights Templar was a branch of Freemasonry would be a useless labor. There's no need to do it because we basically all know it to be true. And, there's a context here, and it's one that we've seen a couple times in some of the earlier people we've talked about, the idea that, in the 18th, 19th centuries, there are a number of different groups and individuals who are claiming to go way back into history and claiming, to continue various groups or beliefs from ancient times. I think I mentioned the ancient order of Druids, founded in the early 18th century, Rosicrucianism, Masons, etc. So this is not the only thing of this kind going on. And the 19th and 20th century writers continue this. Two people I picked out here, this guy, Eugène Arroux, and he identifies the Holy Grail as the Templar gospel, what Templars knew about the Bible but didn't tell anybody. That's the Holy Grail. And this woman is fascinating. She's a wide-ranging spiritualist, I guess you would call her, writes a ton of stuff, and she absolutely connects everybody. Masons, Templars, the Grails, all ancient heresies, all ancient groups, whether they're Hindu or Western or whatever, it's all linked together. And one of the things I found really intriguing, look at this when they're published, and look at when the new editions are issued. Yeah, I don't know what to make of that. And that brings us to the Templars in the modern world. And here there are two things I've chosen to single out. There are probably others. One is extreme right-wing politics. And you can see some of the symbols, belongings, etc. of this. There's a hoodie of this here. So Templar myths are enmeshed in many of the right-wing political groups, and many of them some of the violent ones. Those of you who may remember Anders Breivik murdered 69 teenagers and 8 other people in Norway in 2011. He saw himself as a Templar, claimed a membership in the Templar Knights, by which he meant to espouse racist and anti-Muslim views, and all grounded in this kind of pseudo-crusade rhetoric. The English Defence League, which is a well-known racist group in England, also adopts this is their seal. And their motto, this is great, actually comes from a Wikipedia article on Templars. So we're here in the realm of medievalism, not medieval, but it's pretty pernicious stuff. And there are modern-day Templars. They're continuing to make new Templars. This is the one I found most recently. Many of these guys are ex-military. They include some 2- and 3-star generals. This guy, September 2022, this is taken from his Instagram account, I think. Former Florida congressman, military guy, retired after accusations of war crimes. And he posts this on the day he became a Templar, dedicated to saving Christians in the Holy Land, presumably from those who are not Christian. Whoops. And the Templars are merely one of a number of medieval groups that ultra-right nationalist groups push, identify themselves with, etc. Quite frankly, had I wanted to depress myself and you, I could have done this entire series on those associations alone. Some of you are already familiar with Hitler's use of the Germanic past and Aryans, etc. Celts come in for the same thing, Vikings and Templars also form part of this kind of, well, it's really a search for an all-white Christian European past. And some of it is just so surprising you wouldn't imagine it. You remember Dylan Roof, that guy who killed the black church members down south after sitting and talking with them for like an hour or two? Guess what he had on his tennis shoe? An Irish cross, a Celtic cross. Part of this Celts sort of things. There's Templar imagery used at Charlottesville and here at January 6th. Medieval styles all over the place. It's something that, frankly, as Charity knows, medievalists have to deal with now when we teach. And I don't really want to spend a lot of more time on this. I don't want to give a lot of airtime to it. But I will just put it here, that what we're seeing here is this exact thing. The misuse of the past as a platform for justifying modern hate. It brings us back to the question I've asked time and again, who owns the past? And it also raises the question of, okay, so if people we don't like take over the past, how do we get it back? And I just thought I'd put up as a kind of hopeful thing some of the ways people are taking it back. These are two prominent scholars, medieval scholars now, teaching, as you can see, in excellent institutions, who are adding race into the medieval curriculum, Jews into the medieval curriculum, envisaging a global Middle Ages, or in the case of Cord Whitaker here, that's Jerry Heng here, professor at UT Austin, or in the case of Cord Whitaker, his interest is how medieval, well, it's really kind of what we're doing, how medieval symbols and groups and images are used in modern racial thinking. So there are people who are trying to reprise the past and take it out of the hands of people like Anders Breivik. And that brings me to the last bit, conspiracy theories. This is where the Templars really shine. I mean, this is Umberto Eco thing, and some of it is just so fun. I can't wait to tell you about it. The basic thing about conspiracy theories is that everything is related to everything else, right? Everything explains something else, everything supports something else, etc. And one of the basic things in modern conspiracy theories, the Templar association with the Grail, is taken for granted. And there are those Scottish Grail people again. Look at this, this is 2009. I am not making this up. The Scottish Sun, it must be said, is not the most reliable of newspapers. But still, look at this. Crack the secret of the Holy Grail. It's hidden in Kilwinning, Scotland. Imagine if you owned property there. Wouldn't that be cool? taken to Kilwinning by the Templars in the 14th century because it had the highest concentration of Templar knights in Scotland. This is the best one. It's said in a kind of reproachful way. People looking for the Holy Grail should do their basic history and look closely at Ayrshire. Well, there you go. What can you say? And not just the Grail. Again, everything comes together, right? So this is from, from an online site, which is, that's the gift that just keeps on giving is online stuff. Knights Templar, Holy Grail. Here we've got the Merovingian kings of France, who are another one of these kind of shady groups that get involved. And this is great. They're long-haired characters who have the same birthmark, a red cross on their shoulder, which is quite an amazing physiological thing, even if we knew that much about the Merovingian kings, which we certainly don't, to talk about their birthmarks. This is an actual periodical, The Temple, created in 2002 to encourage research into the Knights Templar and their related subjects. And guess what, guys? You are experts now in a lot of them. Grail legends, Arthurian legends, Masons, early Christianity, Cathars, that's a medieval heretical group, Gnostics, alchemy, the occult, etc. The first article, was there a Templar presence on the Isle of Avalon in the medieval period? Well, offhand, I'm going to say no, but that probably reveals my limitations more than anything else. By the way, Mary Magdalene is good business here, too. And really, the only one missing here, oh, wait a minute. I couldn't believe it when I found this. Why the Templars? Because they wore red a lot in Sherwood Forest. It's like, okay, right. And then in another, Maid Marian becomes the Grail, which is even more wonderful. Yeah, by this time, if you're not thinking of Da Vinci Code, it's because you haven't read or seen it. If you have read or seen it, you're already there. You're already way ahead of me. Da Vinci Code actually rips off a lot from this book, which is even worse. Purports to be serious, and that's where he gets a lot of his stuff. There are now numerous TV and movie series about the Templars, and I just couldn't resist these two. Needless to say, I have not seen them, do not plan to see them, but look at the descriptions, aren't they brilliant? The living corpses of Satan-worshipping Knights Templar hunt for human victims in a 16th century galleon. Right? You find yourself in a 16th century ship, you're already having a bad time, and now you're dealing with these guys. Or this one is really the best. Medieval knights executed for black magic, well, we know who those are, come back to torturing vacationing college kids. I mean, you are a black magic worshiping guy or knight. Who do you come back to torture? Those college kids, they're always on vacation. We're just sick of them. Yeah, let's get rid of them. The internet, as I say, you can always find great stuff on here, and some of it is not malign. It's just kind of believing anything that is proposed. You know, that dome castle where they were held, that tower where they were held with all the graffiti, they actually hand out a little tourist brochure if you take the tour. And it's interesting because most of it actually shows you some of the graffiti they wrote. But look at that, even this brochure can't resist talking about the astonishing predictions of the Templars. I've been there. There are no astonishing predictions. There are not even any boring predictions. There is nothing like that there. But Templars must have predictions because they're prophets. Or any of you who are fond of, and I know my husband is, so this is up here for him, The Curse of Oak Island, wonderful mystery story about a well in Nova Scotia. Well, the Knights Templar were there too. And some of it is just malign, vicious, and dangerous. Look at this. The Freemasons, Illuminati, Judaism to usher in a new world order. Templars behind the murders of JFK and Houdini. And this is great. Look at this. 9/11 is linked to 1118, which is not actually the foundation date of the Templars. It's only off by one, but still. The date of the Templars' formation, and that's why it happened. What can I say? And then Templar video games, which are a delight in themselves. And I really have not played these, but I have done a minimal amount of research on the internet, which is totally legit, I'm sure, and then consulted with a person more knowledgeable than myself just before going on tonight. Assassin's Creed, which, as many of you will know, is a very popular video game. Apparently, the main protagonists are assassins who were an 11th century Shia group, who, needless to say, aren't with us anymore, and on the one hand, and Templars in the other. And the Templars are the bad guys. Isn't that cool? And I just learned tonight, they also come from aliens, which makes it really cool. But the Templars are in there trying to suppress human free will. And the assassins are fighting for free will. So, what can you say? Literally nothing, because I know, that's all I know, right there. Yeah. And that brings us to the very last. Why? Why did this happen? Why are we here talking about it? And obviously one part of this question is why the Templars? And this is a variant of a question that was asked earlier on in this series about why some groups or individuals attract this kind of reinterpretation and some do not. And with the Templars, you can see a lot of things that might have fed into it. The propaganda campaign, the fact that there are mysteries about them, like where the treasure ship and the records went. This is the reigning hypothesis, as far as I can tell, that they went to Cyprus out of Acre and then were destroyed by the Ottomans, but we don't know. The rumors about the tunnels, etc. But I think this is really an important point. There's just enough evidence to interest, but not enough to foreclose options. So we don't know. But some groups lend themselves to this. And here we come back to Umberto Eco again. And some of you may have recognized his quote, "The sure sign of a lunatic," from his book, Foucault's Pendulum. And in Foucault's Pendulum, there are these two disturbed individuals who create a computer game that creates a conspiracy theory by random text generation. So they feed into this computer a bunch of things that they think they then want it to put together into a conspiracy theory to show how it's all related. So you've got all of the usual suspects: Grail, the Templars, Mary Magdalene, Cathars, Gnostics. This is perhaps not expected, Minnie Mouse, but I'm sure she's a great addition. And in Foucault's Pendulum, it becomes real and actually starts killing people, this conspiracy game. So make of that what you will. And isn't this lovely? Umberto Eco did an interview on the historical Dan Brown, and look at what he said. Have you read the Da Vinci Code? There's Dan Brown, very innocent looking. Look at this. The author, Dan Brown, is a character from Foucault's Pendulum. I invented him. He shares my character's fascinations with all of these groups. The principle that everything's connected, I suspect Dan Brown might not even exist. And if anybody can do a better review of Dan Brown's work, I'm not aware of it. And then the second aspect of the question, why conspiracy theories at all? Why do we incline towards them? Are they more interesting? Do they answer some questions for us that ordinary reality doesn't? Do they promise explanations that are otherwise lacking? I don't know the answers to those questions, but I will leave you here think about them. And I'll just make one more observation. One of the other difficulties with Templars is knowing what's real and what's not. It's not always obvious. You know, when we've got the Holy Grail appearing and kill winning, I think we can be fairly certain that we're talking about something made up. But there are some things that are less easy to tell. And should anyone be interested in the question period, we can talk about some of the signs of books or articles that are less deserving of faith than others. But anyway, I'll end here. So.
Thank you so much, Professor Stacy. That was wonderful. While people are writing down their questions, I have some questions that I wrote down. So what's going on in the 12th and the 13th century? You said that like all of the other important orders are all attacked. Is there some larger dynamic?
Oh, what's going on in the 12th and 13th century? Well, partly it's just an observable phenomenon. Many Christian groups are started, like the Cistercians, or like the Franciscans or the Augustinians or whatever, are started on principles of poverty and asceticism. And those groups then just truthfully attract lots of money or gifts or lands, or the Cistercians proved to be very, very good at organizing their land and making profit from it. And as they get more and more visible and more wealthy, they attract a lot more, they'll attract a lot of criticism of hypocrisy. But part of what's going on in the 13th century 13th century, 14th century, et cetera, is also, well, there's one historian that's called it, spoken of the 13th century as the origins of intolerance. So one of the things that's happening in the 13th century is the formation of governments, the formation of church governments and of secular governments, the growth in bureaucracy, the growth in law and judicial administration. And as you define who's in and what's appropriate, you define a lot of people out. And a lot of groups, it's not accidental that a lot of groups, Jews start being persecuted earlier, but gay people, heretics, the sick, there are more and more actions taken against them in the 13th century. And, you know, we're leading into what will ultimately become witchcraft trials, but which, you know, arguably continues much of that same sort of us and them mortality, or mentality. As you define who you are, more and more narrowly, you define who you aren't, more and more broadly. And so that's probably part of it too. But I think the Templars are, I mean, you know, they're a different sort of situation. They're subject to this sort of dynamic, but, you know, the Crusade and the banking really give them a different position than some of those other groups.
Okay, thank you. Question, so this is a sort of follow-up question. Can you describe the development of the banking and financial networks more, and how they were able to set those up and how they worked?
Well, I'm not sure I can describe it in much more detail. I mean, it's clear what problems they're trying to answer. If you are in France and you're a local lord and you decide you want to go on crusade, you're going to have to fund it. And you're going to have to make arrangements for what happens in your absence. And many of them, of course, make wills and, you know, give their property away or act as though they're about to die. Then you're most likely to want to join with some other larger group that you want to go with, you know, and that's where a lot of the kings or central lords come into play, because you don't want to go alone, because you need more equipment and money than you yourself can manage, etc. And those types of larger expeditions finance it often by borrowing. And how the Templars themselves work it, they've clearly got a stash of goods and money, etc., in the Holy Land that they can, dispense when you get there. How their mechanisms of communication work back and forth so that they know that, Lord Dubois or whatever in France deposited, so many livres silver here and should be able to take it out there. There's a lot we don't know about that mechanism because we don't have the account books. All we know is that we see them doing it. And when Louis IX gets captured on Crusade, for example, it's to the Templars that he turns for the borrowing of money that he needs. I mean, people over there are doing a lot of borrowing when they get in a tight spot. You can't, if most of your wealth is in large objects or valuable objects, you can't bring them with you. So, but we would know a lot more if we had those records.
Question, what were the requirements to be a Knight Templar? Like, did you have to have a certain position at birth, money? Could anybody do it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Could anybody do it? I mean, the first thing I think to remember is that there are Templars existing on all sorts of levels. And, to be a heavily armed Knight Templar, you have to have a certain financial position. Because, this is a period in which a heavily armed mounted knight, just one or a few of them, could turn the whole course of a skirmish, because they've got it all and a lot of the other guys don't have very much at all. But in terms of could you, if you were of lesser birth, join in an auxiliary capacity, sure. And of course, a lot of them probably would have come in by virtue of already being men to particular lords who joined the Templar order and entering that way. I think that's probably the way to think of it. As far as we know, a lot of these auxiliary people would have also taken a lot of those vows, etc. You're not going to be one of the main heavy armored Templar guys unless you've got a certain standing ready for it.
Okay, so this question is about the nature of the accusations that were used to take them down. So heresy, but also sodomy, and
Right.
like sort of secret rites and like the tunneling. I just thought that was so unfair just because they were really into digging the tunnels. It seems like people got...
There's very little fair about this. Yeah.
They just really thought tunnels were important. So were other groups that were attacked, like was that common to use that bundle of accusations?
Oh, yeah.
Why were those accusations?
Yeah. I think some of them, yes, not the tunnels under Jerusalem, obviously, but if you're talking about some of the accusations about sexual impropriety, about homosexual activities, for example, murders or, that sort of thing. Frankly, from the 13th century on, a lot of those accusations are interchangeable about groups. And you find, and again, it's part of this us and them phenomenon. You find heretics accused of having sex with Jews, or Jews accused of performing heretical activities or, having leprosy or whatever. I mean, there's this kind of constellation of accusations of behavior or of appearance or whatever that applies to all of these groups, and they become interchangeable, a lot of them. And it's really, lepers are regarded as, leprosy was regarded as a sign of inner sin. So you can talk about something unfair, you can get lepers who are taken as sinful or heretical or whatever because this illness is a manifestation of divine displeasure. But the main point here is, and I think frankly this is a lot of what we're seeing in the modern Templar conspiracy theories, a lot of this has to do with conflating groups that have been designated as undesirable for some reason with one another, and assigning many of the same undesirable characteristics or accusations to those groups without really paying much attention to, whether they're separate groups or whether any of these are true.
Okay, so one more question. I don't actually know. This seems like it might be out of your expertise area, because it's really about Star Wars.
About Star Wars?
Okay.
Well, I can't promise anything, but we'll give it a go.
Okay, were the Templars the model for the Jedi?
Oh yeah. Oh, that's actually pretty good. That's pretty good. Obviously, I don't know the answer, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, the Templar, they would not be the only model for the Jedi, I'm sure. But it would be hard for me to imagine imagining or making up a kind of knightly group with particular rituals and particular forms of behavior, et cetera, that didn't reflect in some way, even if it's distant, this very well-known model. But on the other hand, having said that, it's also the case that most of the modern Templar mythology seems pretty negative. And of course, we're supposed to be rooting for Mark Hamill and his ilk, not the other way around. So I wouldn't say it's directly modeled on it, but I think it'd be hard to not have it in your brain. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's thank Professor Stacy one more time.